Interactive Lesson 1.9, Rhetorical Choices. When we analyze the rhetoric of a text, we're examining what a writer does to achieve their purpose and why they do it this way. We're essentially looking for the different choices that a writer makes. A rhetorical choice is just anything a writer does to persuade. We sometimes call these rhetorical strategies, but essentially it's just any rhetorical means to a rhetorical end. To learn how to identify rhetorical choices in a text, you must first understand the different means of persuasion, that is, the different elements that all writers draw from to make their ideas persuasive. Back in the 4th century BCE, Aristotle categorized 3 different means whereby persuasion is achieved. He said that persuasion was achieved through the reasonableness of the text, through the character of the writer, and through the emotional disposition of the audience. Everything persuasive, he says, that a writer says, will always persuade in one or more of these ways. Not much has changed since Aristotle first wrote that, except that these days we usually refer to the 3 means of persuasion as the 3 appeals, or the 3 rhetorical appeals. Logos, which is persuasion through the reasonableness of the text. Ethos, which is persuasion through the character of the writer. And pathos, which is persuasion through the emotional disposition of the audience. Warning: the terms logos, ethos, and pathos are banned from your writing in this class. The reason for that is that inexperienced writers often use these terms in place of detailed explanation, which makes their analysis vague or otherwise unclear. Also, a lot of students have learned the wrong meanings of these terms, and they carry their misunderstandings into their analyses, which makes their analyses even more confusing. Instead of using those terms, you must discuss how a particular idea in a text persuades, whether it's through arguing some logical reasoning, through characterizing the writer in some fashion, or through stirring specific emotions in the audience. Use phrasing like this in place of the terms ethos, logos, and pathos. Let's look now at some examples of the 3 means of persuasion in action, and we'll start with Queen Elizabeth's speech to the troops at Tilbury. At the end of her speech, the Queen says this: "Not doubting but by your obedience to my general, by your concord in the camp, and by your valor in the field, we shall shortly have a famous victory over those enemies of my God, of my kingdom, and of my people." In this statement, she's persuading through the reasonableness of the text, because she's arguing that if the soldiers do all of these things, then logically they will have a victory. This logical reasoning is designed to make the audience more likely to be persuaded by her message. Another example comes from the beginning of the speech, when she says, "I have always so behaved myself that, under God, I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects. And therefore I am come amongst you, as you see, at this time, not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved in the midst and heat of the battle to live and die amongst you all." This is an example of persuading through the character of the writer, because the Queen is characterizing herself as trusting and loyal to the soldiers. By appearing to possess these qualities, the Queen is trying to make her audience more likely to be persuaded by her message. Another example comes from the middle of the speech, when she says, "I know I have the body of but a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. And think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm." Here we have an example of persuading through the emotional disposition of the audience. The Queen here is attempting to stir indignation or anger in the audience toward Spain and toward the Duke of Parma for their part in attacking England. You could also say that she's attempting to stir patriotism for England, although this is an emotion that she doesn't focus on quite as much with this statement. But by making her audience feel both anger toward the enemy and some patriotism for their homeland, that again is going to place them in the right frame of mind to be more persuaded by her message. You may have noticed that some of my examples persuade through multiple means, and they do. Oftentimes a single sentence can persuade on multiple levels. For instance, let's look again at her final line of the speech when she says, "Not doubting, but by your obedience to my general, by your concord in the blah, blah, blah." We can say that this does persuade through argumentation. It persuades through the reasonableness of the text because she is arguing that the soldiers will have victory because they will do those things. But it also persuades through the character of the speaker. Look at the last three parallel phrases there, "of my God, of my kingdom, and of my people." That deliberately characterizes her as a powerful sovereign, worthy of respect. And so it presents her in a certain light to the audience. We could also say that this line persuades through the emotions of the audience. Look how it starts off. "Not doubting, but by your obedience," meaning I have no doubt that you will be obedient. That assumes that the soldiers will do all of these things, which is a form of flattery, and it's designed to make them feel confident in themselves. Now it's your turn to practice. Respond to the following quick write question reflectively and informally. The purpose is just to get some complete ideas on the page. Again, being able to identify rhetorical choices starts with being able to better see the three means of persuasion at work. That's because each of the three means of persuasion affects audiences differently, and each has its own corresponding kinds of rhetorical constraints. So let's look more closely at the different kinds of rhetorical choices. Logos choices. Logos choices are any attempt to persuade through the reasonableness of the text. That's because audiences, of course, can be persuaded through logic and reason. It's often the most important part of a persuasive text because without reasoning, without any arguments, the rhetoric would just be manipulation. When a writer says something to persuade through reasoning, they may be trying to share a new idea with the audience, change the audience's way of thinking about something, correct a misconception the audience might hold, or change a belief that the audience holds. Let's look at an example of a logos choice. Queen Elizabeth argues that the soldiers will soon win a great victory if they remain obedient to the general, conduct themselves honorably in camp, and fight bravely on the battlefield. Here, the Queen is attempting to change the audience's way of thinking about something, because her audience likely believes their chances of success against the mighty Spanish army and their mighty navy, they might think their chances are pretty low. So the Queen is trying to change their mind about their chances. Here's another example. When John Steinbeck, in his letter to his son, claims that his son shouldn't discount what he feels by arguing that if Tom feels deeply for Susan, then it isn't just puppy love, but something serious. Well, Steinbeck here is attempting to correct a common misconception that his son has. His son clearly has doubts about the validity and sincerity of his feelings. And it's probably, this notion is probably propped up by the common misconception that teenagers can only experience what's called puppy love. So Steinbeck is trying to correct that misconception about puppy love that his son seems to hold. When a writer attempts to persuade through reasoning, it means there must be some corresponding reasoning-based rhetorical obstacle. The audience may know nothing about the subject, for instance, or the audience may think differently than what the writer wants them to think. The audience may hold a different set of beliefs. The audience may have the wrong idea about something. Here's an example of a reasoning-based obstacle. The soldiers at Tilbury likely believe that they will be defeated when the Spanish do finally invade. So to overcome this, the Queen argues that they will win if they do these three things, because these are the kinds of things that can ensure their victory. Here's another example of a reasoning obstacle. When Steinbeck's son is doubting his love is real, since everyone around him always says that teenagers are incapable of feeling real love. So Steinbeck attempts to overcome this misconception by arguing that his son's love is real because his son feels it that way. Sometimes when a writer attempts to persuade through reasoning, there will be a reasoning-based rhetorical advantage for them to utilize for help. The audience may already be familiar with the subject, or they may hold similar ideas or beliefs already to what the writer wants them to hold. Now, this isn't to say that the audience already agrees with the writer's message, just that they're more primed from a reasoning standpoint to receive that message. We can find an example of a reasoning-based advantage in John Winthrop's sermon. And that's because his audience, the Puritans on board the boat, they already know that the Bible and their faith demands that they love one another. So Winthrop uses this by not taking a lot of time out of his sermon to give tons of biblical verses that the Puritans already know to back up his arguments. He instead focuses on arguing the more practical necessities of loving one another, arguing that their camaraderie is what's going to help them survive in the wilderness. Next, let's move on to ethos choices. An ethos choice is any attempt to persuade through the character of the writer. This works because audiences can be persuaded based on who the writer appears to be. So writers will often make themselves appear to possess certain characteristics that the audience would find appealing. For instance, we just naturally tend to believe and want to go along with those individuals that we like, or that we admire, or that we trust. Warning. Ethos is one of the most misunderstood concepts in rhetoric, and it's because a lot of teachers teach it incorrectly. Ethos in ancient Greek means character, not ethics. We derive our modern English word ethics from the ancient Greek word for character. Ethos appeals are not appeals to ethics. Ethos appeals are persuading through who the writer presents themselves to be. In other words, their character or the character that they adopt. When a writer says something to persuade through character, they may be trying to establish a particular persona, or appear to be a certain adjective, appear to be wise or good-willed or affable. They may also be trying to correct certain misconceptions that the audience might have about their character. Here's an example of an ethos choice. Queen Elizabeth concedes that she is a woman, but says she has, quote, the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. Here, she's trying to establish her persona as that of a king, and appear authoritative and powerful. And that's because her audience is pretty misogynistic for this, given this time and place, and they likely believe that men are just more capable in matters of warfare than women are. So the queen is trying to change their perceptions of her from just a mere woman to someone who has all the qualities of a king. Here's another example of an ethos choice, when John Steinbeck repeatedly tells his son that he knows his own feelings better than anyone else. Here, Steinbeck is trying to appear humble and wise and good-willed toward his son. By not telling his child what he should really feel or what he's really feeling, Steinbeck here is trying to appear more trustworthy in his son's eyes by painting himself to be the kind of person who looks out for his son's well-being first. When a writer attempts to persuade through character, it means there must be some corresponding character-based rhetorical obstacles. Perhaps the audience may not know who the writer is, or the audience may perceive the writer in a different way than the writer wants them to. Maybe the audience straight up doesn't like the writer or is hostile towards them. For instance, a character obstacle from Elizabeth I's speech was that women were perceived at the time as inferior to men, so the soldiers at Tilbury may perceive Queen Elizabeth as being incapable of leading the country to victory in a war. So to overcome this, the queen insists that she has the same qualities as a king, that same bravery and cunning as a male sovereign would. The concession that she makes, admitting that she is a woman, that only helps strengthen the character appeal by making it more reasonable. Here's a character obstacle from Steinbeck's letter. Whether earned or not, parents and their children don't always have the most trusting relationships, as parents often make themselves appear to be out of touch with or unsympathetic to what their children are going through. So Steinbeck attempts to overcome this obstacle by making himself appear more trustworthy to his son. And he does this by humbling himself and saying things that will characterize him as good-willed, as wanting only what's best for his son's happiness. Just like with persuasion through reason, sometimes when a writer attempts to persuade through character, there will be character-based rhetorical advantages for them to utilize for help. For instance, the audience may already know who the writer is. They may already perceive the writer in a way that the writer wants them to. They may already respect or trust the writer. Again, this doesn't mean they're fully ready to go along with what the writer says. It's just something that the writer can utilize to help build that persona that they want. An example of a character advantage would be John Steinbeck and his son already clearly having a good relationship. We know this because if they didn't have a good relationship, his son wouldn't have written to Steinbeck in the first place asking for his advice. So what does Steinbeck do with this advantage? Well, he doesn't go out of his way to build any kind of bridges or trust between them because there's no need for Steinbeck to remind his son of all the times he's given his son good advice or this and that. He already has that trust. So instead, Steinbeck needs only to maintain that trust. And this is a good example of the audience-writer relationship within a rhetorical situation having both a significant obstacle and an advantage. Yeah, Steinbeck here uses the advantage to overcome the obstacle. He gives his advice in such a way that it maintains that trust he clearly already has with his son, which helps him overcome any potential mistrust that his son might naturally develop just because he's a child of a parent, and children naturally develop a sort of mistrust with their parents as they grow older. Finally, let's look at pathos choices. A pathos choice is any attempt to persuade through the emotional disposition of the audience. Audiences will often go along with ideas if they're placed in the right emotional state. So writers will often attempt to stir specific emotions in the audience in order to predispose them to accepting the writer's ideas. We are, after all, emotional creatures, and much of our decision-making is based on our emotional state. When a writer says something to persuade through emotions, they're trying to stir a specific emotion, direct that emotion at a particular target, or sometimes they're trying to twist an existing emotion into a related emotion. Here's an example of a pathos choice when Queen Elizabeth says that the Spanish and the Duke of Parma ought to be scorned for daring to invade the borders of her realm. Here she's trying to stir indignation toward the Spanish and the Duke of Parma. And it's because her audience's morale is low. The Queen is trying to help them forget about their dispiritedness and despondency by giving them something new to feel. The soldiers here are clearly looking for someone to blame, someone to despise for what they've had to go through over the last several months or maybe years at this point. So she takes that emotion of indignation and directs it at who she wants it directed at the enemy. Another pathos choice is when John Steinbeck repeatedly tells his son that Tom's feelings are valid and that he is right to feel the way he feels. Here, Steinbeck is attempting to help his son feel confidence. Yeah, confidence is an emotion. And that's because Tom is clearly doubting himself. So his father tries to reassure him. Fear and confidence, by the way, are correlative emotions. The more we feel of one, the less we feel of the other. Warning. Pathos choices and persuasion through emotion has nothing to do with how the speaker feels or how they appear to feel. It's about how the speaker is attempting to make the audience feel. Anything the speaker does to demonstrate their own emotions is persuasion through the character of the speaker, which is an ethos appeal. When a writer attempts to persuade through emotions, it means there must be some corresponding emotion-based rhetorical obstacles. The audience may feel nothing toward the subject matter. The audience may feel some different emotion than what the writer wants them to feel. The audience may feel some closely related emotion as well. An example of an emotional obstacle would be when the English soldiers at Tilbury likely feel frustrated and irritated at their condition, having had to live in camp and stay on alert for months on end, all without being paid what they were promised. So to overcome this, the Queen attempts to redirect that irritation, that antagonism toward the Spanish and the Duke of Parma. And that's because feeling indignation toward what England's enemies have done helps the soldiers forget what the Queen's contributions are to their own misery, because remember, she's the one that hasn't paid them. It directs their anger toward outsiders, which is a tactic many writers have used to deflect from problems at home. These feelings ultimately will help the audience better accept the Queen's message because they won't be angry at her, they found someone else to be angry at. Another emotional obstacle, the fact that Tom clearly feels anxious and fearful about both the future of his relationship with Susan and about his parents' opinions of this professed love. So to overcome this, Steinbeck attempts to put Tom at ease by validating Tom's feelings, welcoming Susan whenever they decide to come visit. Steinbeck here is replacing his son's fear with confidence. Yeah, you might even say that encouragement is the primary purpose of the letter. Yet again, sometimes when a writer attempts to persuade through emotion, there will be an emotion-based rhetorical advantage for them to utilize for help. The audience may feel strongly toward the subject already, or the audience may already feel the emotion the writer wants them to feel. It's an emotional advantage to Queen Elizabeth, for instance, that they are at war, they being England, are at war with the Spanish. And it's very easy to stir anger and animosity toward outsiders, especially if they're being aggressive to the group you belong to. It's just human nature for us to be mistrustful of those who are not part of our culture and community and who are perceived or who are literally attacking that culture or community. So Elizabeth draws on this by stirring up that anger toward the Spanish. The soldiers already likely feel that animosity, or else they wouldn't be out here. They would have deserted a long time ago. The queen just reminds them of that animosity and brings it to the surface. All right, that's it. You've completed this interactive lesson. Go ahead and move on to the next item on today's agenda.